What do you do when the man sleeping with your wife stands 3 seats away, preaching loyalty to a cheering crowd, and you're holding every printed message in your lap, knowing your quiet exit could detonate them both? My name is Jonah Pike, and I learned the hard way that betrayal does not arrive with drama. It arrives with logistics. It arrives with a late charger left on the counter, a jacket thrown over a chair like it owns the place, a phone face down but still vibrating, as if it has something urgent to confess. It arrives with your own brain making excuses on someone else's behalf, because it is cheaper than admitting you married the kind of person who can lie with a clean pulse. If you have never sat in a quiet room and felt your life rearrange itself by a single buzzing notification, then you have been spared a particular sort of humiliation, the kind that tastes like pennies and still makes you say goodnight like everything is fine. For months I told myself that Lila was just busy, just tired, just caught in the current of her community work and the endless volunteer committees she collected like trophies. I told myself the charity events mattered to her the way my paperwork mattered to me, as if purpose could be stapled to the day and filed under noble intentions. I am a notary clerk by trade, which means I spend my hours watching people swear to the truth with straight faces and dry hands. I know how easily words can wear a suit and pass inspection, and I know how often the real story hides in the margins, in the dates, in the times, in the way somebody tries too hard to sound casual. That job should have made me suspicious sooner, but it did something worse instead, because it trained me to assume that truth is simply a matter of documentation, and documentation always exists somewhere if you look long enough. The first crack was not a lipstick smear or a shirt collar, because life is not that considerate. The first crack was laughter coming from her phone while she stood at the sink, rinsing a wine glass like she was scrubbing away the last hour. The laugh was too quiet and too private, the kind people save for someone they want to impress, and she did it without looking at me, which is an old habit of liars. I watched her shoulders lift with it, watched the way she shifted her weight as if she was trying not to be seen, even though we were alone. When she noticed I was watching, she turned the phone face down as if she was protecting it from water, and she told me she was reading something funny from the committee group chat. I nodded like a husband who did not want to ruin a nice evening, which made me complicit in my own future. I did not confront her then, because I still believed in the old myths. I believed confrontation would bring truth, and I believed truth would make things simpler, and I believed she would feel guilty enough to stop. Those beliefs were made for children and romantics, and people who have never met a woman who can smile while she rewrites reality. Lila is not cruel in the way villains are cruel, with deliberate malice and grand speeches. Lila is cruel in the way a person is cruel when they believe their needs are a form of entitlement and everyone else is background scenery. She does not hurt you to watch you bleed. She hurts you because your pain is inconvenient to her schedule. The second crack came with a small, boring detail that should have stayed boring. She said she would be late because of an emergency planning session for the next gala, and she said it the same way she said we needed groceries, as if it was just another item. I asked which venue, and she answered too quickly, then corrected herself, then laughed like she had made a cute mistake. I watched her eyes flick up and to the side for a fraction of a second, which is where people go when they are pulling a fact from somewhere they did not live. I asked what time she would be home, and she gave me a time range, which is what people do when they want space for error, and she kissed my cheek with performative warmth that felt like it had been practiced. When you are married, you learn the difference between affection and performance, because affection comes with a kind of careless honesty. Performance comes with precision. Performance comes with an extra second of eye contact and a hand lingering on your shoulder, and it comes when someone needs something from you, like silence. That night, I cooked dinner for 2 and ate it alone, and when she came home, she told me she had barely eaten because they were so busy. She was not hungry, yet she went straight to the bathroom and locked the door, which is what people do when they want to delete a trail without witnesses. The third crack was the one that finally broke the glass, and it was so ordinary I almost missed it. It happened on a Tuesday, because betrayal loves a weekday, because weekday betrayals hide behind responsibility. I was at the kitchen table with a stack of notarization requests, and she was moving around the apartment in that brisk, purposeful way she uses when she wants to feel important. Her phone lit up on the counter near the sink, face up, and I saw a lock screen preview flash across it, bright as a flare. I did not touch her phone, because I do not need to break laws to break illusions, and because I had promised myself that if I ever found proof, it would be proof that survives scrutiny. I simply looked at what was offered, the way any rational person looks at a sign that says the bridge is out. The message preview was only a few words, but it was enough to make my stomach go cold in a calm, clinical way, like a doctor naming a disease. It wasn't the content that did it first, although the content was intimate in that casual way that assumes privacy. It was the name. It was not a committee member, not a donor, not one of the women Lila constantly mentions like they are her sisters in arms. It was a man's name, and it was written with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. It was the kind of message you send when you believe you are entitled to someone's attention at any hour, and you believe they will respond because they like the way you make them feel. Lila crossed the kitchen and flipped the phone over with a reflex that was too fast to be innocent. She did it while talking about something else, as if she thought my attention could be steered like a shopping cart. She asked me about my day, and she smiled, and she waited for me to be the reliable husband who gives her comfort, who gives her a story she can tell herself about being a good wife, even while she is not. I nodded and answered her with polite, boring sentences, because I was suddenly aware that my survival depended on not letting her see the moment I changed. I finished my work for the day, with the kind of focus you get when your heart is trying not to be loud. Then I went to the bedroom and took my own phone, and I opened my photo gallery, and I looked at the screenshot I had taken of that lock screen preview. The screenshot was not glamorous, not cinematic, not the kind of thing people think of when they imagine evidence. It was a rectangle of glowing text over a blurred wallpaper. It had a timestamp at the top, and it had enough words to show intent, and it had a name that did not belong in our marriage. It was the kind of proof that does not need interpretation, because it is just there, existing, like a bruise. If you have never been gaslit, you might believe that proof ends the argument, but proof is only useful if the system around it respects reality. Lila's system did not. Lila's system was built on charm, on plausible deniability, on rewriting a conversation the moment it ends. That meant I needed more than a single screenshot. I needed a chain. I needed a ledger. I needed the kind of paper trail that forces a liar to either confess or invent a new universe. So I did what I do when I need to make truth survive contact with a person who hates it. I made it physical. I printed the screenshot. I printed it twice, because I have learned that a second copy is the difference between panic and control. Then I took a stack of blank paper and wrote a timeline line on the first page, in my own handwriting, with the date and the time and the location, and I signed it like it was a sworn statement, because in my head it already was. I did not do this because I wanted court drama, and I did not do it because I wanted to ruin her life with some theatrical reveal. I did it because I wanted to keep my mind intact. Paper does not change its story because someone cries. For the next week, I became the kind of husband Lila wanted me to be, because that version of me was useful. I became quiet, agreeable, mildly distracted, the kind of man who can be told anything and will accept it if it comes wrapped in affection. I listened to her volunteer updates. I nodded at the names. I asked the kind of simple questions that make a liar comfortable, because they feel like they are controlling the narrative. I never asked the kind of sharp question that makes them defensive. I watched for patterns instead. I watched the times she left and the times she returned. I watched how she dressed for committee meetings, which somehow required more effort than our anniversaries. I watched how she showered the moment she got home, as if she could rinse away the day's dishonesty with steam. In the middle of all that, I watched myself too, because the most dangerous thing in revenge is losing your discipline. I felt the urge to confront her every time she smiled at me, every time she asked me to be supportive, every time she leaned against my shoulder while her phone buzzed quietly on the other side of the room. Anger was easy. Rage was a shortcut. It would have given her exactly what she wanted, which was a story where I am unstable and she is the victim of my emotions. I refused to give her that. I did not want to win a shouting match. I wanted to win the record. That is how I found the next piece of my evidence without breaking a single rule. She left her phone on the coffee table one evening while she went to the bathroom, and the screen lit up again with a preview. This time, I recognized the rhythm, the familiar, demanding tone of someone who has been rewarded for pushing boundaries. I took another screenshot with my own phone from where I sat, keeping my hands still, keeping my breathing even. It was not hacking. It was not spying. It was simply documenting what was displayed in the open. If she wanted privacy, she should have chosen it. Instead, she chose recklessness because she believed I was blind. 2 screenshots turned into 3, and 3 turned into a small stack of paper that lived in a plain folder behind my work files. I added dates and times. I wrote down the cover stories she used for each night. I wrote down the small details too, the ones people forget they told you, because liars are not consistent, they are only convincing in the moment. I noted when she said her phone battery died, and then later used her phone to scroll through something while claiming it had been dead. I noted when she said traffic was terrible, and then came home with hair that looked too carefully fixed for someone who had been stuck behind brake lights. I noted the way she always tried to feed me the same emotional meal, the same combination of flattery and guilt, which is the diet of a person who wants control without effort. By the end of that week, I did not know everything, but I knew enough to stop pretending. I knew there was an affair partner. I knew the affair partner was close to the charity world Lila worshipped. I knew there was an upcoming gala because she could not stop talking about it, and because the gala was the kind of stage where people turn their private sins into public branding. I also knew the man was going to give a speech about loyalty, because Lila described it with the kind of admiration that made me want to laugh and vomit at the same time. She told me he was inspiring, which is what people say when they confuse performance with character. I should tell you here that I did not decide, in that moment, to destroy them both, not in the cartoonish way people imagine. I did not go looking for weapons. I did not make threats. I did not plot anything illegal because my life is not built for prison fantasies. What I decided was simpler and colder. I decided to let them keep talking until they built the noose themselves, and then I would simply stop holding it up. I printed the messages I had, not because I needed them to be dramatic, but because I needed them to be undeniable. I formatted them by date, and I added my own notes in the margins in clear block letters. I did not include anything that could be called private, beyond what had already been pushed into my life without consent. I printed the timestamps, I printed the names, I printed the pattern. I stapled the pages into a packet, then slid it into a plain manila folder, because the best revenge does not look like revenge. It looks like documentation. The day before the gala, Lila walked through our living room wearing a dress she had borrowed from a friend, and she asked me if it looked okay. I told her it looked perfect because I was done being honest with a person who used honesty as a weapon against me. She asked me if I was excited to attend because she wanted the image of us together, the supportive husband beside the shining volunteer leader. I said yes, because my yes did not mean what she thought it meant anymore. That night, alone in the bathroom, I looked at myself in the mirror and practiced nothing at all. No speech, no confrontation, no dramatic line that would make the story about my anger instead of her choices. I practiced stillness, because stillness is terrifying to people who rely on chaos to survive. I practiced the feeling of holding a folder on my lap while my wife smiled at a man who did not deserve to exist in my world. I practiced the idea of walking out without a word, because silence is an accusation that cannot be argued with. On the morning of the gala, I put the folder into a plain bag like it was paperwork for work, because in a way, it was. I made breakfast for Evan and asked him about school, because children deserve stability even when adults ruin everything. Lila kissed my cheek and told me she loved me in that light, breezy tone that makes love sound like a social habit. I nodded and told her I would see her at the venue because I was not going to give her a private scene. I was going to give her a public vacuum. As I drove to work, my phone buzzed with another preview from her device because the universe has a dark sense of timing. I did not even feel surprised anymore. I felt organized. I felt like a man stepping into a room with a stamped document while everyone else brought opinions. I saved the moment, added it to the ledger, and kept my face calm in the rearview mirror. By the time evening came, I was not nervous, and that was the most frightening part. I had always imagined betrayal would make me reckless, but instead it made me precise. It made me patient. It made me see how much of my marriage had been held together by my willingness to ignore discomfort. I was done ignoring anything. I had printed proof in my bag, and I had a seat waiting for me near a stage where a liar was about to preach loyalty. The only question left was how long I could sit there, 3 seats away, while everyone around me applauded a speech that was written like a joke at my expense, and whether my quiet walkout would be enough to start the collapse. The gala venue looked like the kind of place where people go to feel forgiven in public, because the lighting is soft, and the money is loud, and the cocktails arrive fast enough to blur your moral math. I walked in with my shoulders relaxed and my face blank, wearing the same neutral expression I use at work when someone slides me a document and expects me to pretend the ink is sacred. Lila had insisted this night mattered, and she had said it with the bright urgency of someone building a second life on top of the first, hoping the weight never shows. The room smelled like perfume, polished wood, and applause waiting to happen, and every surface reflected everyone's best version of themselves. I found my seat without hunting for it, because Miranda's people had done the hunting for me. When an organization is obsessed with image, it is also obsessed with placement, and placement tells you more than small talk ever will. The table was close enough to the stage to make my presence visible, but not close enough to suggest I had any influence, which meant I was there as a prop, not a participant. I sat down and placed my bag under the chair the way a polite husband would, while the folder inside it pressed against my knee like a small, patient animal. I could feel the edges of the stapled pages through the thin fabric, and the sensation grounded me in the only reality I trusted. Lila arrived with the timing of someone who wants to be noticed but not questioned, slipping into her chair like she belonged in the center of the room. Her dress was perfect in the way performances are perfect, and she looked at me with a smile that asked for my compliance rather than my affection. She leaned close enough that any observer would think we were intimate, and she said something about how she was glad I came, and how this was important, and how she wanted us to be seen together. I nodded, because nodding costs nothing and it buys silence, and I was not here to argue about optics with someone who had built an affair out of optics. Grant Holloway was 3 seats away, which is a detail that would have sounded petty if it did not feel surgical. He sat with the easy posture of a man who has been told he is inspiring more times than he deserves, and he moved his hands when he spoke to people like he was blessing them with attention. He wore a suit that fit him as if the suit was proud, and he laughed with that effortless confidence that only exists when you do not expect consequences. When he looked toward our end of the table, his eyes slid past me in a professional, neutral way, the way you look at someone you assume is irrelevant, and then his gaze flicked to Lila for half a heartbeat longer than it should have. She did not look back at him. She did not need to. That was the point of their arrangement, the private understanding that they could keep their faces clean while their hands were dirty. Miranda Sloane moved through the crowd like a director, checking her lighting, touching shoulders, adjusting smiles, collecting people's attention without asking. She had the kind of authority that comes from controlling the guest list and the donor narrative, and she used that authority the way some people use family money as an invisible weapon. When she reached our table, she praised Lila's work, praised her commitment, praised her values, and it took effort not to laugh, because I had a folder full of proof that values were the only thing my wife was not committed to. Miranda's eyes moved to me with brief evaluation, and she offered a polite greeting that felt like an inspection. I gave her the same polite expression I give strangers who think they can read me, and she moved on, satisfied that I was the harmless husband who would sit quietly while other people wrote the story. The program began with the usual parade of gratitude and branding, and I watched the room as if I were studying a case file. People clapped on cue, smiled on cue, leaned in to whisper on cue, all of them playing their roles in a theater they insisted was charity. Lila leaned toward me occasionally to share some update about the night, like I needed the narration, like I was an audience member in her life. I kept my responses soft and minimal, because I was not going to spend my words on her anymore. I was saving my energy for the moment she could not edit. Grant eventually rose, and the room shifted into attention like a flock turning in the air. The stage lights caught the sharp angles of his face, and his smile widened with the practiced warmth of a man who knows how to sell sincerity. He began speaking about loyalty, about trust, about the way communities survive when people show up for each other, and the crowd responded like they were hearing scripture. It was impressive, in a bleak way, how easily people applaud words that make them feel better about themselves, even when those words are coming from someone who is actively rotting the meaning from the inside. I sat 3 seats away, exactly as the canon of my humiliation required, with every message printed and waiting in my lap. I slid the folder out just enough to feel its weight, keeping it hidden behind the edge of the tablecloth, the way you keep a knife hidden in a place where knives are not allowed. I did not need to read the pages again. I knew them the way you know a wound. I knew the timestamps and the names, the casual intimacy, the planning, the jokes, the private language that belonged in a marriage and had been outsourced to a stranger. I held the folder steady and watched Grant's face as he talked about loyalty, and I realized he believed his own performance because he had never been forced to face the difference between sounding good and being good. Lila watched him with an expression that might have looked like admiration to anyone else, but to me, it looked like hunger. She did not glance at me once, not when the crowd cheered, not when Grant's voice softened into the tone that makes people feel chosen, not when he said something about honesty being the backbone of love. She did not glance at me because that would have required acknowledging I existed as a full person, and not merely as a cover story. She was smiling, and her smile felt like the last insult. There is a moment, when you are betrayed, where you can decide what kind of ending you want. Some people want fire, because fire looks like justice. Some people want a scene, because a scene makes the pain feel justified. I wanted something colder. I wanted the kind of move that makes a room keep breathing while a lie collapses inside it. I wanted the moment to belong to my restraint, not my rage. So I stood up in the middle of Grant's loyalty speech, and I did it without hurry, without stiffness, without the dramatic pause people use when they want eyes. I picked up my bag, and the folder stayed inside it because the proof did not need to be waved like a flag. My proof was not a weapon in the air. My proof was a blade waiting to be placed on record later. I looked forward, not at Lila, not at Grant, not at Miranda, because looking at them would have granted them the dignity of being seen as partners in a confrontation. They were not. They were subjects in a file. I walked out without a word, and the silence was the loudest thing I had done in years. I could feel heads turning behind me, could feel the sudden discomfort ripple through the room, because people hate ambiguity more than they hate betrayal. A man walking out during a loyalty speech does not fit neatly into a fundraising narrative. It creates a question that cannot be smoothed over by another cocktail. In the hallway, away from the applause, the air felt thinner, and my heart finally started beating like it remembered it was allowed to be angry. I did not stop to breathe through it. I kept walking because momentum is protection. I stepped outside into the night where the cold hit my face like a slap, and I stood under the building's lights for a moment, letting the contrast sober me. The muffled sound of the speech continued behind the glass, and it struck me as absurd that a man could talk about loyalty while my marriage died in a room full of polite strangers. My phone buzzed as I reached my car, and for a moment I expected a flood of calls, a flood of messages, a flood of demands. Instead, there was a single text from Lila that tried to look casual while vibrating with control, asking where I was and why I left. I did not answer, because answering would have given her the conversation she wanted, the one where she gets to frame me as unreasonable. Silence was not just punishment. Silence was strategy. I opened my camera and took a quick photo of the venue's exterior clock and the time on my dash display, because my mind runs on timestamps when my emotions are trying to sabotage me. Then I put the phone down and drove. On the way home, my brain tried to bargain with me, the way it always does when facing loss. It tried to tell me maybe this was all explainable, maybe it was innocent, maybe I was misreading, maybe I was overreacting. I have watched 1,000 people swear to things they do not mean, and I know bargaining is just denial wearing a smarter shirt. I pictured the printed messages in my bag, and remembered how Grant's name looked on the page, how familiar it was, how unafraid. Innocence does not look like that. When I walked into the apartment, the quiet felt staged, like the place itself was holding its breath. Evan was asleep, which was a small mercy, and I moved through the rooms with the careful steps of a man avoiding glass. I went to my desk, pulled out the folder, and laid the pages out under the lamp. I added a new line to my ledger with the time I stood up, the time I exited, and the simple fact that I spoke to nobody. I then placed the pages back into the folder and slid it into a clear sleeve, because I wanted the proof protected from anything messy, including my own hands. I did not sleep much, because my mind kept replaying the image of Grant under the lights, talking about loyalty as if it was a product he had invented. I kept thinking about Lila's face when I stood, and I realized I had not actually looked at her in that moment. That realization surprised me because it meant something had shifted inside me more deeply than anger. I had stopped caring about her performance. I had started caring only about outcomes. By morning, the rumor engine had already started, because it always does. Lila came home with the tight energy of someone who had been questioned by people whose approval she cannot live without. She moved through the kitchen like she was collecting objects to ground herself, and she tried to pull me into a conversation that would turn into a fight, because a fight would give her an excuse. I refused the fight by staying calm, and my calm made her more nervous than any shouting ever could. She wanted a version of me she could describe to others as unstable. I was not going to give her that tool. She eventually tried a different approach, shifting into wounded concern, implying I had embarrassed her, implying I had harmed the charity, implying I was being selfish. The cynicism of that logic almost impressed me. She could betray me, but I was the problem for not smiling through it. I let her talk, because letting people talk is how you learn what they believe will work. While she spoke, I noticed something small and damning, a new script word she used more than once, as if she had practiced it. The word was about my control, about my moods, about my pressure, and I filed it away, because pre-framing is not an accident, it is a plan. Later that day, my phone showed a notification from a shared account, a merchant alert that I owned, tied to a location Lila had claimed she had not visited. The amount was not dramatic, which was the trap, because small amounts hide better than large ones. I saved the alert, printed it, and added it to the sleeve behind the gala timestamp line. It was the first clean link between her story and a documented contradiction, and my mind settled into the cold, focused place it goes when a case starts to right itself. That evening, as the city dimmed and the apartment filled with ordinary sounds, I realized the walkout had done exactly what I needed. It had cracked the mask in public without giving anyone a speech to interpret. Now people were curious. Now people were uncomfortable. Now Miranda's carefully built narrative had a hole in it, and holes make institutions panic. And if institutions panic, they start asking for paper. By the next morning, my silence had turned into a story, because people cannot tolerate a blank space in their social feed, and they will invent one just to feel sane. Lila left early with the rigid posture of someone stepping onto a stage where she was supposed to smile, and I watched her check her phone twice before she reached the door, which told me everything about who she was actually reporting to. She did not look at me like a partner. She looked at me like a risk factor, and the difference between those two looks is a divorce in slow motion. I drove Evan to school and kept my voice steady, because a child can smell fear the way dogs smell storms. He chattered about a class project and a friend who forgot a backpack, and I nodded at the right moments, but my mind kept replaying the way Grant Holloway's face had glowed under those lights, while he said the word loyalty like it was a hymn. It is a strange thing to realize your marriage is being narrated by a stranger with a microphone, and your wife is applauding like she paid admission. It makes you feel both humiliated and oddly relieved, because humiliation is proof that you were right to stop trusting the performance. At work, I did what I always do when I need to keep my hands from shaking, which is to drown my emotions in process. I notarized signatures, stamped dates, and watched people swear to things they believed were harmless. In that room, honesty was a ritual, not a lifestyle, and I understood that better than most. The irony was that my profession had trained me to respect documentation, and now documentation was the only thing standing between me and the version of the story Lila was already trying to sell. Around midday, my phone buzzed with a merchant alert on an account that was mine, not hers, which mattered more than anything else. The amount was small enough to pass as a normal expense, and the location name was the kind of neutral place people use for plausible deniability, a restaurant that could be business or friends or committee planning, depending on what story you needed. The only problem was that Lila had insisted she never went there, not even once, because she had been too busy with events on the other side of town. I stared at the notification the way you stare at a loose thread on a sweater you thought was intact, because once you see it, you cannot unsee what it means. I saved the alert immediately, because you do not argue with a liar using memory. You argue with them using timestamps. Then I took a screenshot and printed it at the office copier, not because it was dramatic, but because paper changes the power dynamic. Screens can be deleted, denied, and reinterpreted as glitches, but paper sits on a table like a quiet accusation. I wrote the date and time in the margin with a steady hand, then placed the sheet into a clear sleeve behind my gala timeline page. The sleeve was becoming a small archive of truths, and the more it grew, the less Lila's reality mattered. When I got home that afternoon, the apartment felt too tidy, like someone had cleaned to erase evidence that did not exist in the first place. Lila was not there yet, which was normal now, but the normal had started to feel like a compromise I never agreed to. I made dinner for Evan, listened to him talk, and let the routine do its job of keeping him anchored. Then, after he went to his room, I pulled out my folder and reviewed what I had with the detached focus of a man building a case against his own life. Lock screen previews, printed messages, a merchant alert, a growing list of cover stories that did not fit their own shape. I was not done, though, because one document does not win against a person who can cry on command. I needed corroboration that did not come from my own mouth, because in a social environment, the person telling the truth is often treated as the aggressor. I needed a neutral line from someone who did not care about my marriage, someone who cared only about what happened and when. That is how I found myself standing at the bar of a restaurant I had never cared about before, asking a bartender manager named Nora Baines for something I did not actually want, which was clarity. Nora was the kind of woman who has seen enough drunk sincerity to distrust all sincerity, and she had a tired, unimpressed expression that made me trust her immediately. I ordered a simple drink and waited until her rush eased. Then I approached the counter in a way that did not look like a demand. I did not mention betrayal. I did not mention my wife. I mentioned an incorrect charge on my account, because that is a language service workers understand without judgment. I showed her the merchant alert on my phone, keeping the screen angled so she could see the date and time, and I asked if she could confirm whether the payment method belonged to me and who had used it. She did not smile, because she was not there to comfort me, and that was exactly what I needed. She glanced at the details, asked for the last 4 digits, then looked down at her system with the efficiency of someone who has done this 100 times, for people who pretend they did not order a second round. She told me the tab was paid with my card, and she told me it was signed by a man, and she told me the man had been seated with a woman who matched the description of my wife, and she said it like she was reading weather. She did not offer commentary. She did not offer sympathy. She simply confirmed the payer and the time, and in that moment I felt the strange relief of watching a lie collapse under the weight of someone else's indifference. I asked her for one more thing, and I did it carefully, because I am not trying to drag strangers into my damage. I asked if she could write a 1-line confirmation on a receipt copy, nothing personal, nothing emotional, just the date, time, and payer identity. She hesitated for a beat, then did it with a pen like she was signing off on a routine correction, and she slid it across to me without making eye contact. That small scrap of paper was more powerful than 1,000 arguments, because it was not mine, and it did not need my tone to be believed. On the drive home, the city looked the same as always, which is one of the cruel jokes of life, because your world can be ending, and the traffic still behaves like it has chores. I kept my hands steady on the wheel and let my thoughts arrange themselves. If Grant paid with my card, then Lila had not only lied about where she was, she had allowed the affair partner to touch my life in a way that was almost intimate in its disrespect. It was not just sex and secrets anymore. It was entitlement, a casual assumption that my resources were part of their playground. When I walked into the apartment, Lila was there, moving around the kitchen with an exaggerated normality that looked like an alibi in motion. She asked how my day was, asked how Evan was, asked whether I wanted to watch something later, and her voice was sweet in that polished way that makes you feel like you are being handled. I answered with polite, boring sentences, because I was not ready to spend my proof yet. I was still collecting the pieces that would make her unable to twist the narrative. She started talking about the charity again, about how tense things had been since the gala, about how people were asking questions, and how Miranda was stressed, and how Grant felt misunderstood. She said misunderstood as if he was a poet whose words had been taken the wrong way, and not a man who had been standing in the wreckage of my marriage with a microphone. She told me I had embarrassed her, and she said it in the tone of someone who thinks embarrassment is worse than betrayal. I watched her mouth shape that complaint and felt something inside me go quiet, like a door locking. Then she tried to bait me into emotion, because emotion is the lever she knows how to pull. She implied I was jealous. She implied I was insecure. She implied my control issues were the reason she needed space. She used the same words she had used earlier, the same script, and it finally clicked that she was not improvising anymore. She was following a plan, and a plan suggests coaching, and coaching suggests someone else had a stake in making me look like the problem. I did not call her out, because calling her out would have warned her that I was listening at the level she feared. Instead, I asked a simple question with a neutral tone, the kind of question that sounds like curiosity, but functions like a pin. I asked where she had been yesterday afternoon, and she answered with the same committee story, The same venue name, the same confident smile. She said it too smoothly again, like she had already rehearsed the line into her bones. I nodded and let her believe it landed. After she went to shower, I took out my folder and added Nora's one-line confirmation to the sleeve behind the merchant alert printout. I wrote the phrase "tab payer confirmed" in the margin, then signed and dated the back of the printout because I know how memory gets attacked. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. Each piece was a small truth, and together they were becoming a structure, something heavier than Lila's charm. The next day, a notification popped up from a public event page for an upcoming fundraiser, and it showed a guest list update, the kind of thing people share without thinking, like it is harmless. I recognized Grant's name again, and I recognized Lila's name near it. And then I noticed a small mismatch in the way the list displayed their roles, as if someone had edited it quickly to hide closeness. I saved the screenshot, because social platforms are the modern equivalent of a public bulletin board, and when people change a bulletin board, they leave traces in the way they do it. By that night, it was no longer just about catching my wife in a lie. It was about understanding who was helping her hold the lie up, and why. Miranda's name kept showing up in Lila's stories, not as a person, but as a force. Lila spoke about her like she was the weather, like she could not be challenged, like she decided what was true by deciding what would be repeated. That kind of power is not accidental, and it is not neutral. It is the kind of power that grows by feeding on other people's mistakes, and I began to suspect that my marriage was not just collateral damage, it was material. I sat at my desk after everyone was asleep, staring at the clear sleeve with its neat stack of truths, and I realized the next phase was not about catching more messages, because I already had enough to prove intimacy. The next phase was about placing the evidence somewhere Lila could not rewrite it, somewhere Miranda could not spin it, somewhere Grant's smile could not deflect it. The moment had to be public, not for drama, but for witnesses, because witnesses create consequences without needing my voice. And the most satisfying part was that I did not need to invent anything. I only needed to stop protecting their story. I stopped thinking of myself as a husband in a marriage and started thinking of myself as a clerk processing a claim that had already been filed, because that shift is what keeps you from doing something stupid for the satisfaction of a loud moment. Lila wanted volume, because volume is the fog she uses to move through rooms without being seen clearly, and if I gave her volume, she would use it to paint me as unstable, controlling, jealous, and therefore untrustworthy. I had already heard the first strokes of that painting in the words she kept repeating with suspicious consistency, and I recognized the technique the way I recognize a forged signature, because forgery is always flatter than the real thing and somehow more confident. The charity world had always sounded soft to me, full of polished phrases and long emails, but now I could see the machinery inside it, the way a boardroom panic can turn into a coordinated social story within hours. After the walkout, the room had not just noticed, it had chosen a side by choosing a narrative, and the easiest narrative was that I was the problem, because it required nobody to look too closely at the smiling people in expensive clothes. Miranda's influence floated around that narrative like perfume, not visible, but undeniable, because every time Lila mentioned the fallout, she used Miranda's name the way people use a lawyer's name, as if the name itself should scare you into compliance. That was the moment I leaned harder into my advantage, which was not intimidation, not money, not social status, but simple documentation. People like Lila are allergic to paper, because paper does not reward performance, and paper does not feel guilty when you cry. I knew the next step had to be something I could hold in my hands, something that did not rely on memory or emotion, because those are the two tools liars are trained to destroy. I also knew I needed to keep the evidence household level and clean, because the moment you start acting like a spy is the moment the liar calls you dangerous, and the audience believes it, not because they are evil, but because they are lazy. So I did the unglamorous work. I sat at my desk one evening while Evan watched a show in his room, and I opened our shared calendar on the tablet we both used for family scheduling, because that calendar was a public space inside our private life. I did not hack anything, and I did not crack any passwords because I did not need to, and also because I wanted the kind of proof that survives when someone tries to twist it into an invasion. The shared calendar was the thing Lila had always used as a shield, because she loved pointing to it as evidence of how busy and important she was, and she never considered that her shield could be turned around and used as a mirror. I exported the week view as a PDF, exactly as it appeared, with the tidy blocks of time and the little headers that pretend human lives are manageable. I saved it, printed it, and wrote the date at the top in pen, because I have learned that digital files feel disposable to people who want to deny them. Then, I pulled out the screenshots I had collected and set them on the table beside the calendar printout, arranging them the way you arrange a timeline for someone who is about to lie to your face. It was not dramatic, but it was steady, and steadiness is what makes manipulation lose oxygen. The calendar alone was not enough, though, because calendars can be explained away with casual excuses, and Lila's favorite language is the casual excuse. I needed a single contradiction that could be understood by a distracted person in under 10 seconds, because that is how you win in public, not by dumping an ocean of detail, but by offering one clean fact that makes the lie wobble. I found it in the overlap, in two events scheduled too close together to be physically possible, one of them a family obligation she had promised Evan, and the other a so-called committee emergency she used to justify another late night. She had created the overlap without noticing, because people who lie constantly start believing their lives are flexible enough to bend around the truth. I printed the calendar header that contained that overlap and highlighted it with a marker, a bright, almost childish stripe that made the contradiction impossible to miss. Then I took one of her cover stories from my ledger, the one she repeated most often, and I wrote it neatly on a separate sheet, as if I were recording testimony. I placed that sheet beside the highlighted calendar printout and took a photo of both together, with the time on my desk clock visible, because I am not sentimental, but I am thorough. The next step was the part I did not want, not because I feared confrontation, but because I hated using my son's normal life as a pressure point. Still, pressure is not always cruelty, and sometimes pressure is simply the reality a liar has been avoiding. Lila had been building her second life by leaning on the stability of the first, and that meant my stability was an asset she felt entitled to borrow. If I wanted the truth to stand up in a room full of witnesses, I needed to show how her lies had started leaking into the child's world, because even donors understand a child, even board members understand optics, even Miranda understands that a smear campaign looks uglier when a kid's routine is part of the collateral. So I hosted a family dinner on a night Lila had not planned for, which was the safest way to see what she did when she could not script the environment. I cooked something simple and normal, because I did not want to create a mood, and I set the table like we were a functioning family. Lila arrived with that bright, forced energy people carry when they have been talking about you behind your back, and she acted as if we were doing something sweet and spontaneous. Evan was excited because children are easily bribed by routine, and I hated that because it reminded me how innocent he was in all this. During dinner, Lila performed motherhood like a person performing on a live stream, with too much patience and too many compliments, and she kept glancing at her phone as if waiting for a cue. She told Evan about the charity again, about how important the upcoming events were, about how everyone depended on her, and she framed it as sacrifice, because sacrifice is the story she tells herself when she wants to feel noble instead of selfish. Evan listened and nodded, then repeated a phrase she had clearly fed him earlier, something about how Mom had to help people, and how Dad should not be mad, and I felt a cold weight settle behind my ribs, because that was the moment I realized she was already recruiting him. I did not react outwardly, because reacting outwardly would have rewarded her strategy. Instead, I asked Evan a simple question about a specific day, the day of the overlap, and I asked it like a normal parent checking on schedules. Evan answered with confidence, and his answer followed Lila's cover story, almost word for word, because children repeat what they are coached to repeat when they want to keep the peace. Lila's eyes flicked to him with quick approval, and then back to me, and the approval was so small and so telling that I almost admired her nerve. I reached down beside my chair and picked up the envelope I had prepared, not as a weapon, but as a test. I slid the highlighted calendar header out and placed it on the table between the plates, the way you place a bill at the end of a meal, calm and final. I did not say much, because I did not need a speech, and I did not want to make this a dramatic courtroom scene in our dining room. I simply pointed to the overlap with the marker and asked, in a flat, ordinary tone, how she could be in two places at once. The table went quiet in the way tables go quiet, when something real enters the room. Evan looked from me to her and back again, confused, because confusion is the first emotion children feel when adults fail them. Lila smiled at first, the automatic smile she uses when she thinks she can charm a moment into obedience, and she tried to explain it away as a mix-up, a mistake, a scheduling glitch. She talked faster than she needed to, which is what people do when they are trying to outrun the fact sitting in front of them. Then she shifted to indignation, because indignation is her second tool, and she implied my question was unfair, that I was hunting for problems, that I was turning nothing into something. I kept my face calm and my voice even, because I have seen what happens when you let emotion hold the pen. I slid the second sheet onto the table, the one with her cover story written neatly in my handwriting, and I placed it beside the highlighted calendar printout so the two pieces made a simple, ugly sentence. I did not accuse her of cheating in front of Evan, because I am not cruel, and because I am not stupid. I simply asked why her story and her schedule could not agree, and I let the silence do its work. Lila's eyes hardened for a moment, and the warmth drained out of her like a curtain dropping. She pivoted, not toward truth, but toward control, and she started talking about my attitude, about my stress, about how I had been off lately, using the same script words I had already logged. She tried to make the evidence feel like my obsession instead of her contradiction, because that is the basic trick of manipulation, turning the spotlight into a weapon and blaming the person who turned it on. Evan watched her and looked at me with the kind of worry children should never have to carry, and I felt my resolve sharpen, because now it was not just my dignity on the line, it was my son's sense of reality. I ended the dinner early without raising my voice, because my goal was not to win an argument, it was to mark a boundary. I sent Evan to his room with a calm explanation about grown-up schedules. Then I returned to the table and collected the papers, because I was not going to leave evidence lying around for her to destroy or photograph out of context. Lila followed me into the kitchen with the tight energy of someone who realizes the audience has changed, and she tried one last tactic, an appeal to intimacy, implying we should talk privately, implying we should handle this as a couple, implying I was humiliating her by making it a thing. That was when I understood how she saw humiliation, and why she feared it more than betrayal. Betrayal was private to her, manageable, soft, something she could compartmentalize. Humiliation was public, uncontrollable, hard, something she could not rewrite once other people saw it. She wanted me to fight in private so she could win in public. I refused. Later that night, when the apartment finally quieted, I took my notebook and wrote down what Evan had repeated, word for word. Then I dated the line and signed it, because I wanted a record of the moment she pulled our child into her lie. I added a note about her script words and her shift from charm to indignation, because those shifts matter when you are dealing with someone who tries to weaponize perception. Then I placed the dinner documents into the clear sleeve behind the merchant alert and Nora's confirmation, building a sequence that told the story without needing my voice. By the time I turned off the lamp, I felt the strange peace of a man who no longer needs to guess. Lila could keep performing, and Grant could keep preaching, and Miranda could keep managing narratives, but I had something they could not fake, which was a simple, documented pattern. The next time I put that pattern in a room with witnesses, it would not matter how charming they were, because charm cannot erase a date, and the best part was that I still had not raised my voice once, which meant they had nothing to point at except the paper. The morning after the dinner, the apartment felt like a staged set after the actors leave, because everything was in place and nothing was true. Lila moved through the rooms with a new kind of precision, not the usual busy volunteer energy, but the controlled agitation of a person who knows the ground under her story has started to shift. She packed Evan's lunch with exaggerated care, asked him 3 questions she already knew the answers to, and smiled too often, as if she was trying to prove to the air itself that she was still the good woman in the good family. When she looked at me, her eyes did not ask how I felt. They measured whether I was going to behave, and that was the moment I stopped seeing her as my wife and started seeing her as a witness who had decided to lie. I kept the morning calm for Evan, because children deserve a world that does not wobble every time adults make selfish choices. I dropped him at school, waited until he disappeared into the building, and sat in my car for a minute longer than necessary, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror like it might offer advice. What I saw was a man who had already done the hard part, which was accepting the truth, and the rest was just procedure. People think revenge is heat, but in real life, revenge is paperwork, and paperwork is my native language. At work, I filed routine documents while my phone lit up with the kind of notifications that used to mean nothing. A volunteer group thread pinged with updates about the charity, then another thread, then a third, and I could tell from the frequency alone that Miranda was moving pieces. Lila did not message me about the dinner. She did not ask how Evan felt. She did not ask why I was suddenly so quiet. Instead, she messaged about the charity's stress, about how donors were unsettled, about how my walkout had created confusion, and she framed it like a civic problem I had caused. The audacity was almost elegant, like watching someone steal your wallet and then complain you made them late. I did not respond, because a response would have been an invitation to a new script. Silence is not absence, it is refusal, and refusal is the only boundary that holds against a person who negotiates reality for sport. I let her messages sit on my screen, then I took a screenshot of the message header showing date and time, because I wanted a clean record of how quickly she pivoted from marriage to reputation management. I added it to my sleeve that evening, behind the calendar overlap, and Nora's one-line confirmation, building the kind of narrative that can be understood by someone who does not care about me. The rumor arrived on schedule, because rumor always does when someone with power needs it. By late afternoon, a mutual acquaintance I barely spoke to sent a casual check-in that was not casual at all, asking if everything was okay, asking if I had been under a lot of stress, asking if I had help. It was phrased like concern, but it carried the shape of an accusation, the subtle suggestion that I was unstable and therefore my actions were suspect. I read it twice, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something I had already suspected. Lila was not just defending herself. She was preparing a public frame where my calm questions could be recast as harassment, and that frame had fingerprints that did not belong to her alone. When I got home, Lila was already there, standing in the kitchen with her phone in her hand like it was a badge. She asked me, politely, whether I intended to keep embarrassing her, and her tone was so composed it almost sounded rehearsed. I did not give her an argument, because arguments are fuel, and she thrives on fuel. I simply asked what she meant by embarrassing her, and she started listing the consequences as if she were reading a report: donors unsettled, volunteers anxious, Miranda under pressure, people asking questions. She said nothing about the dinner, nothing about the overlap, nothing about the contradiction, because she could not afford to make the truth part of the conversation. She needed the conversation to stay in the realm of feelings and impressions, because impressions are easy to edit. I listened the way a clerk listens to a customer describing a problem they caused themselves, with patience and distance. When she realized I would not snap, her mask slipped for a second, and irritation showed through, sharp and ugly. She shifted tactics and implied that my obsession with schedules and proof was unhealthy, and she used those same script words again: control, pressure, mood, like she was tapping a button on a device. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I wanted her to keep talking until she revealed who had coached her. Then she mentioned Miranda's advice in a way that sounded accidental, like she had forgotten it was a tell, and I filed it away with quiet satisfaction. That night, after Evan went to bed, I opened my folder and reviewed it like it was a dossier, because that is what it was becoming. I had the lock screen previews, the printed messages, the merchant alert, Nora's confirmation, the calendar export, the highlighted overlap, the note about Evan repeating her cover story, and now the message trail showing her shift into reputation warfare. It was enough to prove betrayal to anyone with a functioning brain, but proving betrayal was not the real goal anymore. The goal was consequence. The goal was making their social scaffolding fail under the weight of documented truth, without me looking like a man trying to destroy his wife out of spite. I needed a mechanism that could move within 30 days, because time is what liars use to soften outrage. I could not rely on a slow process where she would have months to rewrite me into a villain. I needed something that respected paper and moved fast when reputations were at risk. The charity board was that mechanism, and Miranda's obsession with narrative was the reason it would work, because people who control narratives panic when narratives fracture. The next day, my phone lit up with a screenshot from a donor's public social post announcing they were pausing support until leadership addressed concerns. The post was polite, carefully worded, but the meaning was blunt, and I could almost hear Miranda's teeth grind through the screen. I saved the screenshot immediately, printed it at the office, and placed it into the sleeve behind the gala timestamp line. Donors are not judges, but donors are pressure, and pressure is the language boards understand best. I also noticed something else in the post, a subtle reference to values and transparency that echoed Grant's speech like a cruel joke. That was when I realized Grant was not the core engine of this disaster. He was a mouthpiece, a face that could be pushed forward and sacrificed if needed. The real engine was the person who decided what the room would see and what the room would forget, and that person was Miranda. A man like Grant could be replaced easily in the charity circuit, but a woman like Miranda could not, and that is why she would fight harder and play dirtier. Later that week, a board email update was forwarded in the volunteer chain, and it included a note about internal review and meeting minutes, the kind of sterile language that signals panic without admitting it. I read it with a calm focus, because meeting minutes were exactly where I wanted my evidence to live. Minutes are stubborn. Minutes outlast charm. Minutes cannot be gaslit without leaving another record. I took a screenshot of the relevant lines, printed it, and added it to the folder, because now I had proof the institution was already moving, and I only needed to nudge it with a clean handoff. The challenge was access, because Miranda controlled access the way a bouncer controls a door, and she would not invite me into any room where I could destabilize her narrative. Still, institutions have weak points, and the weak point is always the person who does the actual work. Boards do not function on charisma alone, they function on secretaries, agendas, and typed minutes, and those people tend to respect paper more than personalities. I did not need Miranda to open the door for me. I needed the person who writes down what happens to have a reason to accept my documents. So I made an appointment at the notary counter near the charity's administrative building under a neutral pretense, because neutrality is camouflage. I dressed like I was going to file a routine form, carried my folder like it contained ordinary work, and walked in with a face that suggested I had no interest in drama. The woman at the desk was named Helen Marr, and she had the expression of someone who has spent years watching powerful people pretend rules are optional. She asked what I needed in the flat tone of someone who values efficiency over charm, and I told her I needed to submit a small packet of dated documents to be marked received for a scheduled board review item, keeping my language clean and procedural. I did not mention my wife's name at first. I did not mention Grant. I did not mention betrayal. I mentioned documentation and minutes because that is the language Helen would respond to without flinching. Helen looked at my folder with the kind of cautious attention that suggested she had seen too many messy submissions from people who wanted to weaponize paperwork. She asked what it was about, and I told her it was evidence relevant to a concern impacting donor confidence and leadership integrity, and that my goal was to submit, not to perform. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition, as if she had been waiting for someone to stop talking and start handing over paper. I slid one page across, not the whole story, not the whole stack, just the one-page date-place payment table I had built from my documents, with attachments referenced neatly by label. I kept it simple because simplicity survives meetings and complexity gets buried. Helen read it without reacting, because reacting would be unprofessional, but her fingers paused at the dates, and that pause was the closest thing to applause I needed. She asked if I could provide supporting pages if requested, and I nodded because the supporting pages were already sleeved, labeled, and ready. Then she told me, in the same flat voice, that if I wanted the board to take it seriously, I should submit it before the next gala planning session, because that was when leadership would try to bury anything inconvenient under the noise of event logistics. She did not say Miranda's name, but she did not need to, because her warning carried it like a shadow. I thanked her, because gratitude costs nothing and buys trust, and she told me to bring the packet in a sealed sleeve so she could mark it received properly. She said properly like it mattered, and it did. When I walked back outside, the air felt colder and cleaner, and I realized something that almost made me smile. Lila had spent weeks trying to make me look emotional and unstable, but I had just taken the cleanest possible step, the one that makes institutions nervous. I had moved the truth away from our kitchen table and toward official minutes, where nobody could say it was only my feelings. That night, Lila came home unusually late, and she smelled like champagne and anger disguised as confidence. She told me the next gala was critical, and that Miranda was tightening everything, and she spoke like she was proud to be inside the pressure. She watched my face for a reaction and did not get one, and that made her eyes harden again. Then she said something small, almost careless, about how Grant felt attacked lately, and the way she said attacked carried a hint of fear, as if someone had warned her the story was starting to slip. I nodded, kissed Evan goodnight, and waited until the apartment was quiet. Then I opened my folder, checked my labels, and slipped the one-page table into a fresh sleeve with a date tag, because the next room I would bring it into would not be private, and it would not be forgiving. And the best part was that I still had not accused anyone out loud, which meant the only thing they could fight was the paper. The next few days had the tight, pressurized feeling of a room where someone has spilled something expensive and is pretending it never happened. Lila stopped leaving her phone face up, stopped laughing at messages in front of me, stopped making casual mistakes, which was its own confession because innocent people do not suddenly adopt countermeasures. She also doubled down on her public warmth, the kind of exaggerated sweetness you perform when you know an audience is watching, because she could not stop treating life like a fundraiser. At breakfast, she asked me if I was sleeping okay, asked me if work was stressful, asked me if I had considered talking to someone, and the questions were not questions at all. They were scaffolding for a story where she is concerned and I am unraveling. I answered in flat, courteous sentences, because courtesy is a knife when you refuse to use it theatrically. She wanted a blow-up, a slammed door, a raised voice, something she could describe with hand gestures to people who would nod sympathetically. I gave her none of it, which meant she had to escalate in subtler ways, and subtler ways leave patterns. On Wednesday, she came home carrying a bag of groceries we did not need and announced she had a migraine, as if migraines were a moral shield. She went into our bedroom, dimmed the lights, and lay down dramatically, then called out that she could not talk about anything heavy because she felt sick. 10 minutes later, her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she rolled over to check it with the speed of a person responding to a supervisor, not a symptom. I did not accuse her. I simply noted it, because the point was never to catch her in a single moment. It was to document the repeated hypocrisy that makes her defenses collapse under their own weight. That night, after Evan went to bed, I sat at my desk and reviewed my evidence sleeve like I was checking a file before a hearing. The lock screen previews were still there, printed and dated. The merchant alert was still there, clean and undeniable. Nora's one-line confirmation sat behind it like a brick, because it did not belong to me and therefore could not be dismissed as my opinion. The calendar export and highlighted overlap were there too, because scheduling is the lie's natural enemy. On top of everything, I placed my one-page table, the simplest possible story: dates, places, payments, contradictions, all arranged for a bored reader with power. I sealed the sleeve with tape and wrote the date across the seal in pen because I wanted it to look like what it was, which was a packet prepared by someone who understands chain of custody without being dramatic about it. When you deal with institutions, appearance matters, but not the kind of appearance Miranda worships. Institutions respect seriousness. They respect restraint. They respect people who come in without a show. The next morning at work, my phone lit up with a new notification from the volunteer group thread, a screenshot forwarded by someone who thought they were helping the charity manage optics. The screenshot was a revised guest list for the next gala planning session, and I could tell it had been edited in a hurry because the formatting changed halfway down. Lila's name appeared. Grant's name appeared. Then, between the first screenshot and the second, Grant's role title shifted, and his proximity to Lila's role shifted, as if someone had realized people were watching and decided to pull them apart on paper. I saved both images immediately, because edits are evidence when the edit itself signals fear. I did not need to prove what the list used to say to the entire world. I only needed to show Helen later that leadership was already trying to sanitize the record. I printed the before and after versions, placed them into the sleeve behind the one-page table, and wrote one line in my notebook. Guest list, revised after questions, formatting changed, names repositioned. Then I put my notebook away and did my job, because the fastest way to look unstable is to stop functioning. That afternoon, as I was leaving the office, my phone rang from an unknown number, and I let it go to voicemail, because unknown numbers do not get my attention anymore. A few seconds later, the voicemail notification appeared, and I saw the caller's name attached, which made my jaw tighten with a quiet kind of disgust. It was Grant Holloway. He left a message that sounded like concern wrapped around entitlement, like he was doing me a favor by acknowledging I existed. He said he wanted to clear up a misunderstanding. He said he respected me. He said he did not want things to get messy, and he asked me to call him back. The tone was calm, professional, and completely inappropriate, because nobody calls the husband they have wronged unless they believe the husband is a problem to be managed. He did not ask how Evan was. He did not express guilt. He did not say he was sorry. He talked like a crisis communicator, which told me Miranda's fingerprints were already on him. I did not call him back. Instead, I saved a screenshot of the voicemail timestamp on my phone. Then I wrote the date and time in the margin of a printed copy. It was a small piece of proof, but it mattered because it showed sequence. It showed that after my walkout, after the rumor, after the donor pause, he did not step back. He leaned forward. People who lean forward after being exposed are either desperate or protected. When I got home, Lila was pacing in the kitchen as if she had been waiting for me. Evan was doing homework at the table, and the air was thick with forced normalcy. Lila started talking before I could set my keys down, explaining that Miranda was furious, explaining that donors were asking for a statement, explaining that Grant felt targeted. And then, without even taking a breath, she asked if I was trying to sabotage her work. She said her work the way people say their reputation, the way they say their identity, the way they say their oxygen. I kept my voice calm and asked what she meant by sabotage, and she stared at me like I had insulted her by refusing to play my assigned role. She said I had been cold. She said I had been watching her. She said I had been collecting things. And then she made a small, calculated leap that told me she was getting guidance from someone smarter than her emotions. She suggested that if I was saving private communications, I might be crossing lines. She said it like a warning, like a legal boundary, and I almost smiled because it meant she was scared of paper and trying to make paper look like aggression. I told her I had not touched her phone, and I had not hacked anything, and I said it plainly, like a fact, not like a defense. Then I returned to Evan's homework, asked him about his assignment, and kept my tone steady, because nothing humiliates a manipulator like being forced to behave in front of a child. Lila hovered, waiting for me to snap, waiting for me to say something she could use. I gave her nothing. After a minute, she walked away, and the kitchen felt warmer in her absence, which was its own sad kind of clarity. Later, after Evan went to bed, Lila tried a different tactic, softer and more intimate, because she knows how to adjust her voice the way people adjust lighting. She sat on the edge of the couch and said she missed us, said she felt like we were drifting, said she wanted to reset, and then she suggested we should attend counseling because she was worried about my stress. She said stress like it was an illness she had diagnosed, and I understood exactly what she was doing. She was building a paper trail of concern in case she needed to say later that she tried to help and I refused, that she feared for her safety, that she did everything right. I nodded and told her we could discuss it in mediation because mediation had already been scheduled, and she did not like hearing that word from my mouth. Her eyes narrowed for a second, then she forced them wide again and asked why I was being so formal. I told her formal was the only language that keeps reality from being rewritten. She blinked, then smiled too quickly, then stood and walked away, which told me she did not like the version of me who had stopped negotiating. The next day, Helen texted me from the administrative number she had given, short and clinical, saying the board would have a pre-session before the next gala meeting and that any evidence should be submitted by noon on Friday if it was to be stamped and entered cleanly. The message was not emotional, and it was not friendly, and that made it perfect. I saved a screenshot of it, printed it, and slipped it into the sleeve too, because the timeline of institutional movement mattered as much as the betrayal itself. The board was already shifting under donor pressure. Miranda would be trying to contain it. If my packet became part of minutes, it would stop being my story and start being the organization's problem. On Thursday evening, Grant approached me in the most cowardly way possible, by making it look accidental. I was leaving a small cafe near my office, coffee in hand, when he stepped out from near the window like he had just happened to be there. He wore the same confident smile he had used on stage, but up close the smile looked thinner, as if it needed an audience to feel real. He greeted me by name, called me Jonah like we were acquaintances, and asked if we could talk for a minute, because he wanted to resolve things privately. I told him I did not have anything to resolve with him, and I said it without heat, which made him stiffen slightly. He tried again, leaning into the tone of a man offering peace, implying he cared about the charity, implying he cared about Lila, implying he even cared about Evan, which was an unforgivable move because he had not earned the right to speak my son's name. I let him talk for a few seconds longer than I wanted to, because when people are nervous, they reveal their real priorities. He said something that confirmed what I already suspected, that Miranda was under pressure and needed this handled before it became a formal matter. Formal matter. That was the phrase. The charity director was not worried about morals. She was worried about minutes. Grant, the loyalty prophet, was not worried about loyalty. He was worried about documentation. I stared at him until his smile faltered. Then I walked away without answering his request, because the worst punishment for a man like him is being treated like noise. Back at home, I placed the sealed sleeve on my desk and looked at it like it was a loaded device. It was not dangerous because it contained secrets. It was dangerous because it contained simple truths arranged for maximum clarity. Lila could cry, Grant could charm, Miranda could spin, but paper does not react to any of that. Paper just sits there and refuses to forget. By midnight, my phone buzzed with a new message from Lila, sweet and careful, saying she hoped we could talk tomorrow and that she wanted things to be calm, because Evan deserved calm. She used my son as a shield again, and the cynicism of it made my hands go still. I did not respond. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence. She is using calm as a leash, not a gift. Then I wrote the date and signed beneath it, because I was done letting her control the story of my own mind. Friday was coming, and with it the stamp, the minutes, and the point of no return, and I realized the real test would be whether Miranda tried to block the packet or bury it, because if she did, she would be confessing to the room without saying a word, and if she did not, then she would have to live with evidence received typed into a record she could not edit. Friday arrived with the kind of quiet that feels staged, because everyone in my life was performing calm while preparing to strike. Lila woke early and moved through the apartment like she was tiptoeing around a sleeping bomb, careful not to touch anything that might wake my resolve. She made coffee she did not drink, asked Evan whether he wanted extra fruit he never asks for, and smiled at me with a softness that would have looked loving to a stranger. I recognized it for what it was, a last attempt to pull me back into the private negotiation room where she always wins because she can cry there without witnesses. I kept the morning normal for Evan and left for work with my sealed evidence sleeve in my bag, flat and rigid against my side, like a second spine. The seal line I had written across the tape looked almost ceremonial, which would have embarrassed me in a different life, but now it made me feel steady. When the world gets slippery, you build your own friction. Paper is friction. Dates are friction. A stamped received is friction strong enough to stop a liar mid-sprint. At noon, I took my lunch break and drove to the administrative building near the charity offices, parking 2 streets away because I did not want the drama of being seen arriving at their door like a man begging to be heard. The air outside was cold and bright, the kind that makes people squint, which felt appropriate. Inside, the lobby smelled like toner and old carpet, a scent that always makes me think of bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is where charm goes to die. I approached the desk with the same neutral posture I use when I am handing over routine filings, because nothing about my demeanor could suggest rage or obsession. Rage is easy to dismiss. Procedure is not. Helen Marr was there, seated behind a low partition with a keyboard and a stack of forms, and she looked up with the tired attention of someone who already knows which conversations will waste her time. I placed the sealed sleeve on the counter without flourish and slid it toward her slowly, like I was delivering something fragile rather than explosive. Her eyes flicked to the seal line, then to the date on it, then back to me, and I could tell she appreciated the restraint more than she would ever admit. She asked what it was, not emotionally, just formally, and I gave her the cleanest possible answer. I told her it was a dated documentation packet relevant to donor confidence and leadership integrity, submitted for inclusion in official record review, with a 1-page table on top and supporting attachments labeled behind it. I did not say Lila's name. I did not say Grant's name. I did not say affair. Those words would have turned it into gossip. I needed it to stay procedural, because procedures have teeth. Helen opened the sleeve carefully, not because she feared the content, but because she respected the idea of chain-of-hand custody, even in a civilian setting. She skimmed the 1-page table with a face that barely moved, and that stillness made my stomach settle. When people like Helen react, they choose sides. When they stay still, they are doing the more dangerous thing, which is taking the paper seriously. She checked the attachment labels, flipped to the merchant alert printout, paused at Nora's one-line confirmation, then moved to the calendar export with the highlighted overlap. Her finger hovered for a moment over the guest list before and after, and I watched her eyes narrow as she saw the formatting change. She asked if I could provide the originals if requested, and I told her the originals were either printed from notifications I personally received or screenshots from public materials and a shared calendar I lawfully access, and that I would provide them upon formal request. I kept my voice flat, because the content did not require emotion to be true. Helen nodded once and reached for a stamp. The stamp sound was small, a dull thud against paper, but it was the loudest thing I had heard in weeks. She stamped the sleeve cover sheet with the date and a received mark, then signed beneath it with a quick, practiced hand. She wrote a short note in her intake log without looking up, then slid the stamped copy back toward me. I took it and felt something loosen in my chest, not relief exactly, but the sensation of finally moving the truth out of my private suffering and into a space where it could not be rewritten by a smile. Helen said the board secretary would acknowledge receipt in the pre-session and that minutes would reflect evidence received if leadership allowed it to proceed cleanly. She did not name anyone, but the way she said leadership made it obvious who she meant. The subtle implication was clear. Someone might try to stop this, not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. I thanked her without overdoing it, because gratitude is more believable when it is understated, and she gave me a final look that carried a warning. She told me, in a calm voice, that if anyone contacted me to resolve it informally, I should keep my communications minimal, because informal resolution is how records disappear. On the walk back to my car, the city looked sharper, edges cleaner, like my eyes were finally seeing what my mind had been denying for too long. I placed the stamped copy into my bag and drove straight back to work, because I wanted my day to remain boring. A bored, functioning man is hard to smear. A distracted, reactive man is easy. By late afternoon, Lila's behavior shifted. She started texting more frequently, not angry, not pleading, but managing, the way a person manages a fire they hope nobody notices. She said she wanted us to talk tonight. She said Miranda was concerned. She said there had been misunderstandings and it would be better for everyone if we handled things privately. She avoided specifics with surgical discipline, which told me she already knew what had been submitted and was working off a strategy. She also used the word privately more than once, and I could almost see the hand behind it, guiding her phrasing. When I got home, Lila was waiting in the kitchen, posture rigid, smile carefully assembled. Evan was in his room, and the apartment felt like a hallway between two doors, one leading to normal life and the other to consequences. Lila tried to begin softly, talking about stress, about boundaries, about how she felt unsafe with my documentation obsession, and she introduced the idea as if it was her own worry. I watched her closely, not for what she said, but for what she repeated, because repetition is where coaching lives. She implied I had violated privacy. She implied my behavior could be considered harassment. She implied that if I escalated things, it could affect my access to Evan, because conflict is not good for children. The threats were disguised as concern, and I recognized that as the hand of someone who knows institutions. Lila has instincts, but she does not have legal phrasing. Those phrases belong to Miranda's world, the world where perception is currency and accusations are investments. I kept my voice calm and asked one simple question, the kind that forces a manipulator to commit to a claim. I asked what, specifically, I had done that crossed a line. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that hesitation was the first honest thing she had offered me in months. Then she said I had been saving messages. I asked how she knew. She answered too fast and then corrected her tone, suggesting she had guessed, suggesting she had sensed it. Her eyes flicked away as she said it, and I felt the cold certainty lock into place. Someone had told her. That was when the first major twist finally clicked into focus, not as a dramatic reveal, but as a structural truth. Grant was not leading this. Lila was not even leading this. The affair was real, but it was also useful. It was leverage, a way to keep Lila compliant, a way to bind her to a narrative that could be controlled, a way to make sure she stayed grateful to the institution that protected her. Miranda did not just manage donors. Miranda managed people. She turned their mistakes into her ownership. I did not accuse Miranda aloud, because accusations without paper are just feelings, and feelings are what Lila wanted. I told Lila I would not discuss anything in vague terms, and that if she had a concern, she could put it in writing. The request made her stiffen, because writing is where her confidence goes to die. She tried to pivot again, suggesting counseling, suggesting mediation, suggesting anything that would keep this in private rooms with soft lighting. I told her we could speak in a formal setting with a neutral facilitator present, because I was done being isolated in conversations she could rewrite the next morning. Her face shifted, and for a second the performance dropped, replaced by raw irritation and a thin slice of fear. She said she did not want to be humiliated. She said she did not deserve this. She said she was trying to do good in the world. The words came out like a speech, and I had the ugly sensation of hearing Grant's loyalty sermon echo through my kitchen. They both worshipped the same God, public approval, and they both believed it should protect them from consequences. I ended the conversation without escalation, because ending a conversation is a power move when the other person relies on endless talk. I went to check on Evan, asked him about school, and kept my voice warm, because warmth with a child is not performance, it is protection. Lila stood in the hallway for a moment like she wanted to follow, then she stopped herself, and I realized she did not want Evan to hear her lose control. She needed him as an image, too. Later that night, after the apartment quieted, I opened my folder and added one new entry to the ledger, a simple line about her threats disguised as concern, and her sudden focus on privacy and harassment language. I wrote the date, signed it, and placed the stamped receipt copy at the front of the sleeve like a header. Then I noticed something I had not seen before, not because it was new, but because I had finally trained my eyes to look for it. On the counter near the sink, partially hidden under a stack of mail, was a printed draft of a statement on charity letterhead, the kind of sanitized, carefully worded language used to address concerns without addressing anything. My name did not appear, but the phrasing described a disruptive attendee at the gala, and implied leadership had taken steps to ensure guest safety moving forward. The implication was subtle, but the target was obvious. They were preparing to paint my walkout as a threat. They were preparing a narrative where I was the danger and Grant was the victim. I picked up the page and felt the paper tremble slightly between my fingers, not from fear, but from disgust. This was not just an affair anymore. This was an institutional smear in motion, the kind that can ruin a man quietly while the room claps for loyalty speeches. I took a photo of the draft beside today's date on the newspaper, then placed the draft into a clear sleeve, because even their preemptive lies deserved documentation. I did not sleep much, because my mind kept replaying the stamp sound and the sight of that draft statement. The stamp meant the truth was now in the building. The draft meant the institution was already trying to fight back. That combination was dangerous, because it meant Miranda would not simply deny. She would escalate. She would try to make me look like the villain before the minutes could make her look like what she was. By morning, I understood something simple and cold. The board pre-session was going to be a test, not of my evidence, but of who controlled the record. And if Miranda could not control the record, she would try to control the room. Either way, the next time Grant spoke about loyalty, he would not be speaking into a safe audience anymore. Saturday morning felt too bright for what was happening, as if the sky had been bribed to act innocent. Lila moved through the apartment with a controlled chill, no sweetness this time, no careful concern, just a quiet resentment that made her footsteps sharper. She did not mention the draft statement I found. She did not ask why her copy was missing from the counter. She simply poured coffee, stared through me, and left with a coat that looked like armor. Evan watched her go with the kind of silent question children carry when they know adults are hiding something, and I told him she had an early meeting because it was easier than telling him his mother was building a lie with other people. I spent the day doing normal things on purpose: laundry, grocery runs, homework checks, because normality is a weapon against a smear campaign. If someone wants to paint you as volatile, the simplest sabotage is to remain boring. Still, every ordinary moment had a second layer now, a sense that I was living in a house where the walls had ears and the air itself was keeping minutes. Lila returned late afternoon with the brittle energy of someone who had been coached to stay calm, and I could tell from the way she avoided my eyes that she had new instructions. That night, after Evan went to bed, she finally spoke. She stood in the doorway of the living room like she wanted to be seen without stepping into the room, and she asked me, in a flat voice, whether I planned to keep doing this. She did not define this, because defining it would have required naming her choices. I asked what she meant. She said I was trying to ruin everything she had built. She said people were talking. She said the board was concerned. She said I was making her look bad. She never said she had lied. She never said she had betrayed me. She talked like reputation was the only real currency, and I realized the affair had not made her feel guilty. It had made her feel exposed. I told her I was not discussing anything in vague terms anymore, and if she wanted to make a claim, she could write it down. The request landed like a slap, because it forced her to choose between theater and accountability. She tightened her jaw and said she would not put anything in writing because she did not trust me. I nodded and told her trust was not an option, it was a consequence, and she had already spent it. She walked away without another word, which is what people do when they cannot win with their favorite tools. On Sunday, a mutual friend sent another message, softer this time, asking if I was okay and whether I wanted to talk, and I recognized it as a probe. I thanked them politely and declined. Then I saved the message anyway, because patterns matter. A smear does not start with a headline. It starts with concerned texts and vague questions and small suggestions that you are not stable. It starts with people who like you being invited to pity you, because pity is a polite form of dismissal. Monday morning, the administrative building was busier than usual, which told me something important without anyone saying it. When institutions panic, they schedule. They create meetings. They hide behind agendas. I had a stamped receipt and a submission in the system, and now the system had to decide whether to respect itself or protect its queen. I dropped Evan at school, went to work, and kept my day unremarkable until the moment I stepped out for my lunch break. I arrived at the building 10 minutes before the pre-session began, not because I expected to be invited in, but because I wanted to be present in the safest way possible. Presence changes behavior. People spin more carefully when the person they are spinning about is nearby. I stayed in the lobby with a coffee and my phone in my pocket, looking like a man waiting for an appointment. Helen Marr was at the desk again, and she gave me a brief nod that said nothing and meant everything. The board secretary arrived first, a lean woman named Tessa Ward who moved like someone who has spent years collecting other people's words and keeping her face neutral. She carried a laptop and a stack of folders, and she greeted Helen with the kind of professional warmth that is less about friendship and more about shared survival. Minutes people always find each other. They are the ones who keep the world honest when everyone else is performing. Tessa glanced at me and then looked away, which told me she knew who I was without needing to be told. Then Miranda Sloan walked in, and the temperature in the lobby shifted. She was dressed for authority, tailored and calm, and she held her phone like it was an extension of her nervous system. She did not look like a woman about to lose control of a narrative. She looked like a woman who believed narratives belonged to her the way property belongs to landlords. Lila followed behind her, half a step back, which is where people stand when they are trying to be protected by power. Grant Holloway arrived last, and he did not look at me directly at first, as if my existence was a stain he hoped the light would ignore. Miranda spoke to Helen at the desk with a smile that never reached her eyes. I could not hear every word, but I heard enough to recognize the tactic. She was trying to define what was appropriate for the record. She was trying to set boundaries around what could be received. She was trying to turn a stamped submission into a discretionary choice. Helen's posture stayed flat and professional, which was the closest thing to resistance you get in a lobby full of power. Tessa stepped forward and asked for the intake log, and Helen handed it over. Tessa scanned the entries with quick, practiced eyes, then paused at mine. I saw her glance at Miranda, then back at the log. Miranda's smile tightened. Tessa asked for the packet. Helen pointed toward the internal file tray, and Miranda's hand moved slightly, as if she wanted to intercept it. Tessa raised one finger, not rude, just firm, the universal sign for procedure. Miranda froze, because you cannot bully a minute-taker without leaving a trace. They moved into the meeting room down the hall, and the lobby quieted again, but not the way a peaceful place quiets. It quieted like a stage between acts. I stayed where I was, not because I could influence what happened inside, but because I wanted to witness the movement around it. If Miranda tried to block the packet, I wanted to see who she called and how she did it. If she tried to push a narrative, I wanted to see whether Grant and Lila followed it like trained performers. 20 minutes later, the door opened and Tessa stepped out to print something at the lobby station. She glanced at me briefly, then looked away again, and I noticed her expression was tighter than before. A minute after that, Miranda stepped out too, phone in hand, walking fast, and she spoke in a low voice near the hallway corner. She was not calm now. She was managing damage. Grant followed her and lingered a few steps behind like a man waiting for instructions. Lila stayed in the room, which told me she was being used as a shield, kept inside where her face could be read by the board if needed. Helen's phone buzzed, and she looked at the screen, then glanced at me without moving her head much. She did not speak, but her eyes carried a small warning. Someone had called. Someone was trying to redirect. I watched Miranda's posture by the hallway and understood the shape of what she was doing. She was not arguing the facts. She was arguing the legitimacy of the record. Tessa returned to the room, and a few minutes later the door opened again. This time, an older man in a board member badge walked out, followed by Tessa. He looked down the hall, then toward Helen, then toward me, and I felt the moment sharpen. People with power do not like surprises. They like clean stories, but they like scandals even less, and my packet was a scandal dressed as paperwork. Tessa approached Helen's desk and asked for the stamped receipt copy attached to my submission. Helen produced it from her file because Helen was not here to protect Miranda. She was here to protect the process. Tessa reviewed it, then looked at the board member and nodded once. The man exhaled slowly, like someone accepting that a door had closed behind him. He said something quietly to Tessa, then turned and walked back into the room. Miranda reappeared in the doorway, her face composed again, but her eyes flat. She scanned the lobby and found me instantly this time. Her gaze held mine for a second, and in that second, I could feel the full weight of her intent. She wanted to provoke me into an outburst. She wanted to reduce me to a stereotype, the angry husband, the jealous man, the unstable threat. I did not give her what she wanted. I held her gaze with a neutral expression, then looked away, because looking away is not weakness when you are refusing to play. A few minutes later, Helen stepped out from behind the desk and approached me, careful and professional. She handed me a small printed slip, not the whole minutes, not any confidential material, just a single line on official letterhead with a date and a simple phrase. Evidence received, pre-session review opened. There was no drama in it. That was the beauty. One line can do more damage than a speech if it sits in the right place. I took the slip and felt my hands stay steady, which surprised me, because part of me had expected my body to react like this was a fight. It was not a fight. It was a record. Helen told me, quietly, that leadership had pushed back, that Miranda had tried to characterize the packet as disruptive, and that the board member present had refused to ignore a stamped submission. She did not give me names beyond what I could already see, and she did not need to. The system had accepted the truth as an object, and now Miranda had to deal with it in a room where her charm was limited by procedure. I thanked Helen and stepped outside into the cold air because I did not want to linger in the lobby like a man savoring chaos. Savoring chaos is how you look guilty. I walked to my car and sat for a moment with the slip in my hand, reading the line again and again, not because it changed, but because it anchored me. When I got home, Lila was already there, and she looked like someone who had survived a meeting by bleeding internally. Her smile was gone. Her voice was controlled in a way that sounded painful. She asked where I had been at lunch, and the question was too specific to be curiosity. Someone had told her I was nearby. The fact that she asked meant she feared optics. She feared witnesses. She feared that I might speak. I told her I had an appointment. She asked with whom. I told her it was not her business anymore. That answer landed harder than any insult because it was procedural. She took a breath as if she wanted to shout, then remembered she could not, because shouting would break the narrative she was trying to preserve. Instead, she said Miranda wanted a private conversation with me to clear the air. She said it like a privilege being offered. That was when the second major twist began to take shape, not fully revealed yet, but close enough to taste. If Miranda wanted to speak privately, it was not to apologize. It was to negotiate, and if she was negotiating, it meant she had something to lose beyond donor optics. It meant the affair was not just a personal scandal. It was connected to the institution's internal protections, the kind of protections that can become a policy breach if exposed. Grant was not just a speaker. He was a liability, and Lila was not just a wife. She was a tool. I told Lila I would not meet anyone privately, and if Miranda had a request, she could send it through official channels. Lila's eyes flared with anger, then cooled quickly into calculation. She said the next gala planning session would be sensitive, and she said it like a threat dressed as information. She implied that if I showed up again, it would be ugly. I nodded and told her ugly was what happens when people build their lives on lies and then blame the light. That night, I added the evidence received slip to the front of my sleeve and wrote one more line in my notebook. Miranda is pushing for a private meeting. That means the scandal touches policy. Then I wrote the date and signed it, because my mind was no longer a place for guesses. It was a place for records. And as I turned off the lamp, I realized something that made my mouth go dry. The next room would not be a lobby. The next room would be a public arena where Miranda could not hide behind procedure, and where Grant could not preach without witnesses remembering his hypocrisy. If they wanted to keep their story alive, they would have to kill mine in public, and that meant the final confrontation was coming whether I rushed it or not. By Tuesday, the charity machine had moved from denial to containment, and containment always looks like politeness with teeth. Lila stopped pretending we were a couple in private and started treating me like an operational threat, which was almost honest of her, because at least it matched the way she had been living. She spoke only when she had to, and when she did, every sentence sounded like it had been approved by a committee, which meant Miranda was still holding her leash. Evan noticed the change the way children always do, quietly, with questions that land like needles, and I kept answering in calm, ordinary language, because the only thing I would not let Lila steal was my son's sense of reality. At work, My day stayed deliberately boring, because boredom is a shield when someone is trying to paint you as volatile. Still, the messages kept coming from the edges of our shared life, concerned check-ins from acquaintances, subtle questions from people who never used to ask questions, and a few carefully phrased offers to help me get through a hard time. Those offers were not compassion, they were reconnaissance. Miranda's world does not wait for facts. It builds a mood first, then forces facts to fit the mood later. I saved the messages anyway, because the pattern mattered, and because it was not lost on me that they were trying to create a story where I was unstable before any record could create a story where Lila was dishonest. That afternoon, Helen Marr sent a short update through the administrative number, stating that the board secretary had entered the submission line into the pre-session notes, and that leadership was requesting a private clarification meeting before the next public-facing event. The request itself was the tell. Institutions do not request private clarification when they believe something is harmless. They request it when they suspect the harm is real, and they want to manage how it lands. I saved the update, printed it, and slipped it into the sleeve behind the evidence received slip, not because I needed more proof of betrayal, but because I needed a clean record of institutional behavior under pressure. When I got home, Lila was in the kitchen slicing fruit as if she were rehearsing motherhood, and her hands moved with careful precision that did not match her eyes. Her eyes were too alert, scanning my posture and my expression the way people scan a room for exits. She asked me, with forced calm, whether I planned to attend the next gala planning session, and the question sounded casual until you heard the threat living inside it. I told her I had no interest in causing a scene, and I meant it, because a scene would have been a gift to the draft statement she had left on the counter. Then I added in the same calm tone that I did have interest in the record staying honest. Her jaw tightened, and I could almost hear Miranda's voice in her head, reminding her not to lose control. Lila tried to redirect into parenting, implying that any conflict would hurt Evan, implying that I should think about stability, implying that my insistence on documentation was selfish. She always reaches for the child when she wants moral cover. I told her I was thinking about stability, and that stability requires adults telling the truth. The sentence hung in the air like a closed door. She did not reply. She just stared at the cutting board, as if it had offended her. That night, after Evan went to sleep, I went to my desk and checked my folder again, not to soothe myself, but to keep my mind disciplined. The printed messages were still the core, because they showed the intimacy and the pattern. The merchant alert and Nora's confirmation were still the cleanest proof that their affair had moved from private betrayal into public entitlement. The calendar export and overlap were still the simplest contradiction. The guest list edits were still the sign of institutional fear. The evidence received slip was still the first official crack in Miranda's shield. I was not collecting trophies. I was building a structure, and structures do not rely on emotion. I was about to close the folder when I noticed the printer tray in the corner of the room, the small home printer Lila uses for event materials and sign-up sheets. A single page was sitting there, half-printed, as if someone had hit print and then panicked mid-job. The top carried charity letterhead and a familiar corporate tone, the kind that pretends empathy while sharpening a blade. The page described a guest safety concern related to the previous gala, and it referenced an incident summary and a recommended boundary plan for future events. My name was not printed, but the language described a male spouse, disruptive behavior, and a pattern of intimidation, and the timing matched my walkout perfectly, as if leaving quietly had been recast as a threat by sheer force of narrative. The late twist did not arrive as a shout. It arrived as a calm, ugly realization that the affair and the smear were now fused, and that Lila was not only betraying me, she was cooperating in building a false record about me. That was worse than the sex, worse than the lies, because it targeted my future relationship with my child, and my ability to function in public without being treated like a hazard. It was a pre-built alibi script for her, and a pre-built villain script for me, and I could see how it would work. If the charity labeled me a safety risk, then any public consequence I triggered would be reframed as evidence of my instability. If I fought back emotionally, it would confirm their story. If I stayed quiet, it would allow their story to spread unchallenged. I did not rip the page up. I did not march into the bedroom with it. I did not do anything that could be described later as threatening. I took out my phone and photographed the page beside today's newspaper and the visible time on my desk clock, because when someone is building a false record, your first job is to preserve the draft. Then I printed a second copy of the page myself, cleanly, without adding anything, because I wanted a version that could not be dismissed as a partial print error. I placed both copies into separate sleeves and labeled them as draft safety narrative materials, because giving something a name is how you keep it from dissolving into confusion. The next morning, I used the only lawful tool I needed, which was mundane confirmation. I called the venue office using the publicly listed number and asked in a neutral voice whether any incident report had been filed on the night of the gala regarding guest safety. I did not name Lila. I did not name Grant. I did not accuse anyone. I simply asked whether an incident report existed, because if an incident report existed, the charity's draft would be grounded in something real, and if it did not exist, the draft was evidence of fabrication. The venue manager who answered spoke with the tired patience of someone who fields petty requests all day. They asked for the date, asked for the event name, and then confirmed without drama that no formal incident report had been filed that night, and that if a guest had been escorted out or a disturbance documented, it would appear in their internal log. They offered to send a one-line confirmation by email, and I accepted, because one-line confirmations are how reality survives a smear. When the email arrived, I saved the header, printed the first line, and added it behind the draft statement pages, because now I had a clean, neutral contradiction. The charity was preparing to claim safety concerns that the venue had not recorded, which meant the safety narrative was not a response to my behavior. It was an instrument. That afternoon, Helen sent another brief note stating that the board chair had requested that any safety-related claims be supported by venue documentation before being included in formal communications. That was the second crack, and it told me the board was not fully under Miranda's control. Miranda could still manage donors, she could still manage volunteers, but she could not fully manage procedures when procedures demanded support. I printed Helen's note and placed it with the draft pages and the venue confirmation because the story was no longer just about betrayal. It was about record integrity, and record integrity is an institution's weak point. Lila came home that night looking tighter, as if she had been forced to swallow a conversation she could not spit out. She did not mention the printer tray. She did not mention the draft. She did not mention the venue. Instead, she tried to bait me into the private meeting again, saying Miranda wanted to clear misunderstandings and that Grant was willing to say whatever needed to be said to smooth things over. The way she said say whatever needed to be said was almost an admission that truth was optional in their world. I told her I did not need private explanations. I needed the record to match reality. Her eyes flashed with anger, then cooled again into calculation. I could feel the end approaching, not as a dramatic climax, but as an inevitable collision between documentation and performance. If Miranda could not bury my packet, she would try to bury me. If she could not smear me into silence, she would try to negotiate my silence. Either way, the next public event would be the arena where the institution would have to choose which truth it wanted to protect. Late that night, I sat at my desk and created one final clean page, a simple timeline with dates and labels, not a speech, not an essay, just a neutral map of reality. At the top, I wrote one sentence that mattered more than everything else, a sentence I would never say out loud because it did not need my voice to land. If you want to claim safety, you need a report. If you want to claim loyalty, you need clean hands. I placed the page into a sleeve and set it beside the stamped receipt copy, because I understood the next move had to be surgical. Then my phone buzzed with a calendar update notification from the shared account, a new event added for the charity's public planning session at the gala venue, with Grant listed as the featured speaker again, and the subject line included the word loyalty, like they were daring the universe to laugh. I stared at the screen until the notification faded, and in that fading I felt the last piece click into place. They were going to repeat the sermon, repeat the performance, and repeat the lie, and they believed repetition would drown the record. It would not. And as I slid the folder into my bag for the next day, I realized the real confrontation was not going to be between me and Lila, or even me and Grant, but between Miranda's narrative and the paper that refused to forget. The day of the public planning session arrived with a kind of manic politeness, the sort that exists when people sense danger but refuse to admit it. I dropped Evan at school and held my smile steady until he walked inside, because he deserved a parent who did not leak dread into his morning. Then I drove toward the venue with my folder in my bag and my face arranged into the safest expression a man can wear in a room full of people who want him to be the villain. I was not there to argue. I was not there to plead. I was there to let documentation do what shouting never can, which is make denial expensive. The venue lobby was already crowded with volunteers, coordinators, and donors who pretended they were just there for coffee and updates, when in reality, they were there to watch the narrative stabilize. Miranda had chosen the room carefully, a bright space with glass walls and a staff desk that made everything feel supervised. She wanted witnesses for her version, not for mine. Grant stood near the front in a tailored suit, shaking hands with that practiced warmth, and the sight of him made my stomach go cold because I could already hear the cadence of the speech he would deliver. The same morality theater, the same loyalty sermon, the same clean words covering dirty behavior. Lila moved between clusters of people with a clipped smile, eyes scanning, posture tight, and she avoided looking directly at me as if my presence could contaminate the air. Miranda spotted me the moment I entered because she never misses a threat. She approached with a smile that looked like professionalism until you felt the edge under it. She asked if I needed assistance, asked if I was here for the session, asked if everything was all right at home, and the questions were all designed to place me into a box labeled unstable without ever saying the word. I told her I was here as an attendee and that I intended to sit quietly. She nodded, and her eyes flicked to my bag for half a second, which told me she knew exactly what I carried and feared it more than any raised voice. The session began with Miranda speaking first, framing the organization's values, emphasizing transparency, promising care, and hinting at safety without naming anything, because she wanted the audience to assume she was responding to a reasonable concern. Grant followed her, stepping into the spotlight like he belonged there, and he began talking about loyalty again, the same polished language that makes people feel virtuous for clapping. I sat in the second row this time, close enough to be seen, but not close enough to be accused of looming. I kept my hands still and my posture neutral, because the only trap left was reaction. As Grant spoke, I watched the room, not for sympathy, but for the points where attention would lock. People leaned in at the word loyalty. People nodded at the word trust. People smiled at the word community. Miranda watched the audience like a conductor watching a choir, and I could see the exact moment she decided the room was under control again. That was when I stood up, not fast, not dramatic, and I walked toward the staff desk where Tessa Ward, the board secretary, sat with her laptop open and her fingers poised to type minutes. I did not speak into the microphone. I did not interrupt the speech with a shout. I approached Tessa and placed a single sealed sleeve on the desk with the received stamp visible, along with the one-page neutral timeline I had prepared. The paper did not accuse anyone with adjectives. It listed dates, places, payments, contradictions, and the venue's one-line confirmation that no incident report existed. It also included the draft safety narrative page, labeled as a draft, with the photo timestamp and the venue denial behind it. My only spoken sentence was quiet and procedural, asking her to enter the packet as a record item already received, and to note that leadership had circulated safety language without venue support. Tessa's eyes lifted, took in the stamp, then moved across the timeline. She did not react outwardly. She simply nodded once and typed a line into her minutes. I watched the screen for a second and saw the words "evidence received" appear in the live record, because Tessa typed like she was sealing a door. Behind me, Grant's speech faltered for a heartbeat, not because he knew details, but because he could feel the room shift, and rooms do shift when paper lands. Miranda's smile froze, then returned tighter, as if she were trying to clamp it onto her face. I did not turn toward the audience. I did not look at Lila. I did not look at Grant. I did not need to. The humiliation was not a theatrical exposure. The humiliation was the silence the room fell into as people realized the loyalty sermon was being spoken within arm's reach of documented hypocrisy. I walked back to my seat without haste, sat down, and folded my hands, because I wanted the story to be that I did nothing but deliver paper. Grant tried to continue, but his cadence changed. He sounded less confident, more careful, like a man suddenly aware that every moral word can become a weapon against him. Miranda stepped forward at the end with her practiced closing remarks, but her voice carried strain now, the strain of someone forced to acknowledge a record. She thanked everyone, promised follow-up, and suggested a short recess, which was her way of stopping the room from asking questions while she regained control. I stood during the recess and walked out exactly the way I had planned, without a word to anyone, because words create arguments, and arguments create opportunities for spin. At the door, Lila finally caught up to me, face pale, eyes sharp with panic. She did not beg. She did not apologize. She hissed that I was destroying her, and the phrase was revealing because it admitted she understood the truth as destruction. I looked at her once, calmly, and then I walked out into the cold air as if she were a stranger trying to sell me something I no longer needed. In my car, my phone buzzed with a new notification from Helen's administrative line, stating that the minutes had recorded evidence received and that the board chair had requested a formal ethics review based on documentation submitted. The words sat on the screen like a verdict, and I felt the strange, clean relief of a consequence that did not require my rage. I drove to pick up Evan with my face steady, because the record had done what it needed to do, and the rest would unfold without me becoming the monster they tried to invent.